5D Mark IV, there's a new additional type of RAW file, and it's called dual pixel RAW. You can capture that, and it lets you do some extra adjustments in post-processing that we've never seen before. If you turn this feature on, your RAW files will double in size. Then you'll be able to make one of 3 adjustments to your file only using DPP software that came with your camera. One option is to make very slight adjustments to the focal point within your depth of field. One option is to shift the out of focus areas that are behind your subject, which needs to be in focus. And then the third option is to get rid of some slight ghosting or flare, as long as the source of that lens flare isn't within the frame. So if you can't see that specular highlight, you might be able to get rid of that lens flare. You turn on Dual Pixel RAW in the first camera menu. Sometimes lights like LEDs or fluorescent lights flicker. It's too fast for the human eye to see, but depending on your shutter speed and when the shutter fires, it could affect your exposure accuracy. In the fourth camera menu, you can turn on Anti-Flicker Shoot, and it's going to slightly adjust your shutter firing time to help you avoid those bad exposures. There's a set of variables that you can adjust to maximize things in your image like sharpness or contrast or saturation, color tone, and other variables to give you the best in-camera JPEG capabilities depending on your subject. These are called picture styles. Now I leave mine set to standard because if I want to tweak those characteristics, I always do it in post-processing in like Photoshop or Lightroom. But if you want to do those in camera and adjust them yourself, touch the Q in the quick control screen and then touch the middle box on the far left side. Touching different boxes gives you a brief description, but if you press that info at the bottom, you'll see all the detailed settings and even move the sliders if you want. On the back of the camera, there's the quick control dial, and there's a lock slider underneath that. And by default, that only locks the quick control dial. But if you also want to have it lock more controls so you don't accidentally bump things while you're shooting, you can actually make those changes. Go to the number 5 wrench menu and select Multi-Function Lock. All along we've been using the quick control screen in this class, but if you want to have your very own customized quick control screen like we talked about at the very beginning, setup is going to be intuitive, and you start by going to the 3rd wrench menu and choose Custom Quick Control. Then follow the on-screen prompts and make your own quick control screen. When you press the info button several times, by default you're going to go to a blank screen, then the settings screen, then the level, then the quick control, and so on. If you happen to want to change this or not display one of those options, like you want to get rid of the level for some reason, go to the 3rd wrench menu and pick Info Button Display Options. The focus confirmation beep can get really annoying, like if you're shooting at a wedding or a school play. Choose the Disable Beep command in the first camera menu. Exposure bracketing is really a nice feature that lets you take a shot plus darker and lighter exposures. From the quick control screen, touch the Q and then touch the exposure compensation dotted line, that numbered line. Now just turn the main dial to the right. The further you turn it to the right, the farther apart your extra exposures will be from your base exposure. Sometimes you'll want to focus and then recompose in order to take your shot. You want to half press the shutter button to grab focus, then you press this asterisk button on the back just above your thumb and you hold it to lock focus. Then recompose your shot and press the shutter button all the way. That's my collection of simple settings you'll probably start using now that you know about them. Autofocus with the Canon EOS 5D Mark IV is a state-of-the-art, fast, accurate, and highly configurable experience in both the viewfinder and live view shooting. Of course, you can't really control it when you're in the A+ shooting mode, but in the other shooting modes, you can. There are 3 major things that we can control with autofocus. The operation, which is basically if you lock focus or if you're constantly refocusing during your shooting. There's the area, which is your point or region that is the main focus. And then there are focus behaviors, and Canon calls these cases or case options. These are fine-tuning behaviors like tracking acceleration and deceleration of moving objects, or deciding whether or not to ignore objects that move across your primary focus point, like maybe the bars on a zoo enclosure or foreground objects while you're tracking an athlete running around a track. With autofocus operation, you have three choices. Bring up your quick control screen, touch the cue, and then touch the box right above the cue. Mine says one shot, and that's the default. That means that when you half press the shutter button to grab focus, it will set the focus, and even if you wait a little bit while you're holding that down halfway before you complete the shutter press all the way, or if your subject moves, it's not going to change focus. You want to use this for still subjects. Now the one called AI Servo is constantly focusing, as long as you keep that shutter button half pressed. And it will even try to track your subject if your subject moves before you complete your shutter press. So you want to use something like AI Servo for moving subjects or sports or wildlife. Then, if you want a bit more flexibility, set it to AI Focus. That's the focus operation that tries to use artificial intelligence. So it's going to start with one shot for still subjects, and it's going to use the servo if your subject starts to move. This is where I generally leave my camera because it does a pretty darn good job in a wide variety of shooting situations. Now let's talk about autofocus area. In A+ mode, everything is automatic, including the camera picking your in-focus subjects. You can use the same fully automatic AF mode in other shooting modes if you want, or you can get more and more precise focus point selection options. Later we'll cover live view autofocus, but for now, you need to be in a shooting mode that's not A+, and you need to make sure you have live view turned off. And while you can use the top LCD to select your autofocus mode, we're going to do it with the options in the rear LCD just to make it easier. So for that to work, you'll need to be in the quick control screen again. Then press the button at the top right of the back of the camera, right above where you grip with your thumb. When you do that, you'll see a grid that represents all of the focus points in your focus area, and that shows up on the rear screen. And you'll also see the 7 options for picking the specific focus points or focus area that you want. For the next thing we're going to do, you could use the MFN button, and that's up by the shutter button, but Canon added a very new, very convenient autofocus area button. It's called the autofocus area select button, and that's on the back of the camera, right above the quick control dial. It's just really convenient. It's right there with your thumb. So just press that, and it's going to scroll through those 7 autofocus area or autofocus point options. From left to right, here's what you get. You're going to start with the first one, which is pinpoint precise. And the second one is also very precise, but it does pay just a little bit of attention to the pixel area right around the main focus point. The icon with boxes that looks like a plus sign takes the upper, lower, left, and right points into consideration along with the main focus point in the middle. The next option is called AF Area Surround, and that's going to add even more surrounding points to the focus group. But the center point is still the primary focus. Manual Select Zone is the next, and it seems like a similar collection of boxes or AF points, but rather than giving the center point the priority, this zone focus mode gives equal weight to everything in that box area, and the camera picks what it thinks is best inside the highlighted box area. The next option is just a very large zone where all the focus points in the zone have equal value, and the camera picks what it thinks should be the subject and worthy of the primary focus. Then the last one is full auto. This is where the camera does its best to guess what should be the subject. Except for that last one, and it's called Auto Selection AF, you have either zones or specific focus points that you might want to move around in the viewfinder to focus on your subject. And you'll want to move your focus area while you're looking through your optical viewfinder. By default, you need to press that button at the top right on the back, and then you use the multi-controller joystick, that's the thumb joystick here, to move your autofocus point or your autofocus zone around. That's 2 steps. Here's how to make it so that your multi-controller is always ready to move your focus point with only a single press. From the quick control screen, touch the Q. Then you want to touch the little camera icon near the top right. This gives you quick access to reprogram all kinds of functions of lots of buttons and dials. Ignore all that stuff except for the one that's the second to last on the right. When you touch that, it should say multi-controller at the top of your screen. Quickly touch it a second time, and you'll see that your 2 choices are autofocus point selection or off. It's off by default, but just touch AF point selection, and then whenever you're shooting and you want to move the autofocus point or the zone in your optical viewfinder, just do it with that thumb joystick. There is no need for a second button press to activate that function. There are 61 autofocus points on the 5D Mark IV, and 41 of those are cross-type sensors. Newer lenses are going to be able to use most, if not all, of the autofocus points, even at f8. But depending on your lens, your mileage might vary. So you want to check out page 115 of your manual for more specific information. Now let's talk about live view focus options. In live view, you just have 2 operations: the single shot for stills or the servo for tracking moving subjects. And you have 3 choices for specific focus points or zones. Canon calls these AF methods. In live view, touch the Q at the top right of the LCD, and then the 2 sets of controls are at the top left. The second one down is the single shot versus servo option. And the top one covers those 3 methods I was talking about. You want to touch that, and the 3 options come across the bottom of your screen. The first one is face focus plus tracking. And if you have a face in your image area, the camera will automatically see it and focus on it. It'll also track the face if the face moves around in the frame and if servo is turned on. It'll do what it can to continuously stay focused on the face. Even if there's not a face in the frame, if you happen to touch focus somewhere in the frame and then the object or the camera moves and reframes the subject, the autofocus system, again, is going to try and track the subject. Next is called Flexi Zone Multi, which is like a zone of autofocus that you can move around that zone. And the last one is a smaller zone they call Flexi Zone Single. I don't think it's actually a single point, but it is the most precise that you can do during live view autofocus. For live view, I always leave it set to face plus tracking, and then I touch where I want to focus and use the touch shutter sometimes, like we talked about earlier. Now let's talk about autofocus cases. I call these behaviors. The Canon 5D Mark IV has a really robust autofocus menu with tons of autofocus cases, which I call behaviors. Plus, there's an incredible amount of fine-tuning that you can do with each of these cases. We just can't go through all of this stuff in this class, but let me get you started so that you know what's going on. Press the menu button, and then touch AF, the tab at the top, and then touch 1 to get to the first AF menu. The first menu has 6 cases, and each one of these has a brief description. Then under the description, there are 3 adjustable characteristics, and these include tracking sensitivity, acceleration-deceleration tracking, and autofocus point auto switching. My brief recommendation here is to start by using case 1, but go ahead and look at all 6 of them. And when you touch on each one to look at it, notice that you can also touch the info button or the info help on the lower left of the screen, and you'll get a really detailed description of that case. You should also realize that some descriptions are long, and you can actually scroll through when that description comes up on screen. My other suggestion here is to start on page 127 of your manual and look at the information about AI servo autofocus characteristics. Depending on what you shoot and how much action is involved, this can really help you capture more in-focus images than ever before. Okay, that's pretty much all the detailed and complicated stuff. The rest of the lessons that we have here move along a little more quickly, and they're a little shorter. Next up is white balance and metering. Since you're watching this class, I'm guessing you just picked up a new Canon 5D Mark IV, so let me say congratulations. This is a great camera. Now, in my mind, this is the best all-around DSLR that you can buy. The mix of performance and customizable features make this my personal favorite DSLR available today. Now, because the camera is absolutely packed with amazing capabilities and programmability, this class is going to be a little longer than some of the other camera classes might be. And even with that, there will be stuff we just don't have time to dig into. But once you see how this class is structured, you'll be able to go at it at your own pace and come away with a rock-solid understanding of this awesome camera. And I have some great news. I only had hands-on with this camera for a couple of days, and during that time, I was actually preparing my notes for this class. So the pictures I shot with it are just like a croton in my backyard and a picture hanging on the wall in my office. The reason that's great news is because that Canon Explorer of Light, Rick Salmon, and Scott Kelby both had hands-on with the 5D Mark IV, and they both went to Iceland, and you'll be looking at their pictures during this class instead of my lame backyard test pictures. So first, there's a quick start lesson so that you can get going fast. And then we're going to dig deeper into various topics like shooting modes, autofocus, and the autofocus system is really robust. We're going to get into exposure and video so that you can jump right into the set of answers that you need in the specific lesson where you have questions. Besides those topics, I got a few lessons for you about simple settings that you'll need to know about, like in-camera processing, starting with the amazing 4K workflow. It's like shooting crystal clear printable JPEGs at 30 frames a second, and there's a lesson about some miscellaneous cool extras. And we'll wrap up with a list of additional resources and things that you can look into that we just don't even have time to cover in this class. One last thing, as we get going, let me say that whenever I'm talking about the top left or the top right of the camera to mention certain controls, I'm actually talking about how we hold the camera to shoot it. So let's get started with the quick start lesson. As you can see, there's a lot to the Canon EOS 5D Mark IV. 30.4 megapixel images and 4K video are just the tip of the iceberg. If you've watched this whole class, you're better informed about this camera than just about anybody who doesn't work at Canon. I want to encourage you to go shoot with your 5D Mark IV now, and when you have time, dig into these extra things which we didn't cover in this class. The 5D Mark IV has Wi-Fi and near-field communication, and you can use that to transfer images and even use the free Canon remote control software on a compatible smartphone to fully control your camera remotely. It's like having that LCD touchscreen on your phone remotely. If you're using Canon speedlights, you can use your camera to control them. All of Chapter 7 in the manual is all about flash photography with the 5D Mark IV. And finally, your camera came with a software CD that has Canon Digital Photo Professional, we call it DPP, software. As of this recording, this is the only way to process 5D Mark IV RAW and dual pixel RAW files and take advantage of that dual pixel RAW adjustment in post-processing. You want to spend a little time with that program so you get the most out of your RAW files. I hope you enjoyed this class and learned what you needed to feel comfortable with your 5D Mark IV. It's a great camera. You know how we went through setting up your camera in time-lapse video capture? The result is a playable 1080p movie, but you could shoot full 30.4 megapixel stills and then save those to your computer, where you could later assemble them into a time-lapse movie or just enjoy the stills from a time-lapse period of time. That's called interval shooting, and the setup screen looks pretty much like the time-lapse movie setup screen did. Make sure the live view toggle is set to still image capture, and then go to the fourth camera shooting menu. Earlier I told you that you would use a remote shutter release cable for bulb mode, but there's another option. When you're using the bulb shooting mode, go into menus and pick the second item in the fourth camera menu. It's a timer. We talked about how to shoot 3 exposures in a bracketed set, but maybe you want to shoot 5 or 7 exposures. You can change the bracketed set total in the first Custom Functions menu, where it says number of bracketed shots. And by the way, the custom functions menu is the tab that's a little picture of a camera, but it has those 5 dots underneath it over on the right. If you want to turn on a grid overlay or an electronic level or a bunch of indicator icons in your optical viewfinder, you want to go into the second wrench menu and choose Viewfinder Display near the bottom. Now you can customize the extras that you see in that viewfinder when you're shooting. When we covered exposure compensation, we covered how you can tell the camera to make things brighter or darker than its base exposure. The camera would tweak the aperture or the shutter speed or the ISO in order to make that happen. But if you're shooting with Canon compatible flashes and using the camera to control flash power, you'll appreciate that you can tweak your flash power a little brighter or a little darker as well. From the quick control screen, touch the Q and then touch the box that's to the right of that numbered line. That's flash exposure compensation. The 5D Mark IV has a built-in GPS. Now I'm not going to cover how to do all the GPS settings here because there's way too much to cover, but you will want to know what the GPS can do so that you can pick the right settings for your usage. And I'll also tell you where the GPS settings are. They're in Chapter 5 on page 227. So the GPS has a couple of modes, and one of the modes gets regular signals to the camera even when the camera is turned off. That's nice if you want to log the route that you traveled, but it does drain your battery over time. The GPS can geotag images, of course, and it can be used to set your camera's timer or your clock in the camera. And finally, if you want to see that route that you traveled or see where you shot the shots you took on a map, you'd use the map utility software that came with your camera. I'm used to capturing a bracketed set of images and putting those together in Photoshop to get my HDR images, but if you want the camera to capture 3 consecutive images and then merge them all together right there in camera, you want to turn on HDR shooting. In order to do that, you need to press the Creative Photo button. It's right below the menu button on the top left, and touch HDR. That's where you can set the dynamic range, whether you want to stay in HDR mode or just grab one set of 3 images to create your HDR, and so on. I probably don't even have to tell you now that the 5D Mark IV can capture multiple exposures. If you want to experiment with that type of creativity, just press that same Creative Photo button, and the middle double box icon gives you settings that you need for multiple exposures. When you take a really long exposure, even at night, there's a possibility that light could leak into your camera from the optical viewfinder. There's a little piece of plastic that came with your camera, and you probably didn't even realize what that is. It's an eyepiece cover. It's designed to stay on your camera strap, and then you pop it in place to cover the eyepiece whenever you do an extended exposure. One more cool thing your 5D Mark IV can do is stream video out of the HDMI port. You could use that to connect to a flat panel for image or video review, but you can also stream live video out of your camera to a 1080p video recorder of some kind. You want to flip your live view toggle to the video mode and then press the menu button. Go to the 5th camera menu and pick HDMI display down near the bottom. This is where you choose whether or not you want the camera data overlays to be displayed on top of your video image that's piped out of the HDMI, and you can choose to turn off the camera LCD and just have the video go straight out to your HDMI device if you want. I'm a big fan of improving images on my computer with Photoshop or DPP software from Canon, and I am not an in-camera image processing guy. So for most of the in-camera processing, if you want to learn it, you'll need to read Chapter 11 of your manual starting on page 445. Having said that though, there are some things the camera does to improve your images and capture cool shots that I do use, and the first one is awesome. It's basically a way to get your camera to capture shots at 30 frames per second instead of the 7 frames per second burst rate that we talked about earlier. You start by shooting 4K video, like maybe sports or even a lightning storm. Then press the playback button. That's the one with the triangle in it on the left, just above the trash button at the lower left. Now, when a video comes up on your screen, there's a big arrow that you would press to start playing it. Don't do that. What you want to do instead is press the Set button at the top left, and your movie control buttons are going to appear across the bottom edge of your screen. You can play back in slow motion. You can even forward it one frame at a time, and when you get to the frame that you want to keep, you want to touch the icon on the far right that's just above the scissors icon. Then touch OK to confirm that you want to save that as a JPEG image, and it'll be saved into your JPEG images. If you happen to be shooting images that seem to have clipped highlights, you can turn on a feature called Highlight Tone Priority, and then your shots will have smoother highlights with more detail in those clipped areas. It's the middle of the third camera menu. Just keep in mind, this isn't retroactive for shots that you already shot. Imagine your 5D Mark IV is an amazing camera-shaped computer, and mounting practically any Canon lens on it means that the computer knows all about that lens and it could correct for known lens anomalies. Well, it is. Go to the first camera menu near the bottom and choose Lens Aberration Correction. Inside there, you'll see a list of known characteristics like peripheral illumination, that's going to be vignetting. There's one called chromatic aberration, and there's more. Turn on one of those settings and the camera will compensate for your lens as you take each shot. So like I said, if you want to do actual post-processing shooting in your camera, just be sure to check out Chapter 11 in your manual. So here are the basics that you need to know about so you can get shooting right away. Charge your battery and put it in the camera. You'll always put it in the right way if you put the metal contacts in first. You need a memory card or two so that you can capture your images or video. The two memory card slots are compact flash and SD. So if you have both card types, put one in each slot. The dial on the top left is the mode dial, and it has a push button lock in the middle. So push the lock button and then spin the dial counterclockwise all the way until the green A+ lines up with that white mark that tells you what shooting mode you're in. The A+ is the Scene Intelligent Auto mode. Basically, that's fully automatic mode. So assuming you have your lens mounted on your 5D4 and assuming the autofocus and manual focus toggle on your lens is set to AF for autofocus, you're ready to shoot. A quick side note here though, if this is your first full frame Canon and you're moving up from a Rebel or some other APS-C sensor camera, do not try to put your EF-S lenses on this camera. It won't work because the mounts are not the same. You can mount a full frame EF lens on an APS-C sensor camera, but you can't put EF-S lenses on a full frame camera. And if you don't believe me and you try it, there's a chance that you could accidentally knock an internal part loose called the focusing screen and damage it. Don't ask me how I know that. So full auto means that you don't have much control over things like focus points, exposure settings, and stuff like that. But at this point, you're probably just ready to start shooting, and you're probably going to grab some sweet 30.4 megapixel images. Why do I say probably? Well, there are a few more things that you should do to make sure that you actually are shooting and saving what you think you are. For example, I always format my memory cards when I first put them into a camera so I don't have old images or old data from some other camera that might not be compatible with the structure of Canon in the memory card file for the 5D4. And you'll want to check your image size and your image type, and you'll probably want to set the drive mode. Now, the drive mode is what you do when you snap shots. It could be a single shot or it could be continuous shots. Maybe it's 7 frames a second. And one more thing is a simple setting to make sure that you're really looking at things as sharply as possible when you're using the optical viewfinder and you hold the camera up to your eye. That's an easy one to forget. When you first hold the camera up to your eye and look through the viewfinder, go ahead and half press the shutter button, and some numbers are going to appear across the bottom of the viewfinder in that internal screen for a second or two. And while they're there, you want to turn this dioptric adjustment knob, that's easy to say, dioptric adjustment knob, so that those numbers are tack sharp. Don't pay any attention to the image that you're looking at, just look at those numbers. Now you might have to half press the shutter a few times because those numbers go away pretty quickly. One of the best features about the 5D4 is the fact that it's a full-frame pro camera with a fully functional touch screen. And we're going to use it quite a bit in this class. With practically every setting, you can usually do it with some buttons and dials, and there's usually 2 or 3 ways to adjust almost everything in the camera. But for the most part, I'll show you the quickest, easiest way, and most of the time, that means we're going to be using the touch screen a lot. Right now, we're going to look into the menus, and you should know that the menus are going to be simplified when you're in that A+ shooting mode. When you flip to another shooting mode, there are going to be a bunch more menu options, and we'll get to that later in the class. But for now, press the menu button at the top left, and that's on the back at the top left. There are 3 main tabs across the top. There's one that looks like a little picture of a camera. There's the playback menu and the wrench. And under each main tab, there are also a few screens, and those are going to be represented by the numbers near the tabs at the top. Touch the wrench, and if you're not in the first menu in the wrench area, touch the 1. Then touch where it says Format Card, and you can touch the 1 or 2 to format the compact flash or SD card. Format whatever cards you have in your camera by touching and following the on-screen prompts. Now, you need to tell your memory cards how to behave, and you do this in that same first wrench menu. Touch the top item. It says Record Function plus Card Folder Select. And inside the menu at the top it says Standard by default. Touch that and you'll have 4 ways to record stuff into your cards. Standard just saves files to your primary memory card, which is the compact flash by default. Auto Switch is going to fill up your primary card, and then it goes to the other card as overflow. Record Separately lets you save different files to each memory card so that you could put JPEGs on one and RAW on the other. And the last one records the exact same stuff to both cards simultaneously. So you actually have a backup going on 2 cards at once. I usually use the auto switch, but pick whichever one you want. After you touch to pick your card recording behavior, the menu below Record Function is Record/Play, and that's where you pick your primary memory card slot. Now I said it was the CF card slot, but you could change that if you want. When you're done in this screen, touch where it says Menu at the bottom right. Now touch the camera icon and pick the first camera settings menu. Touch the image quality at the top, and under JPEG, touch the L with the smooth curve. This is going to be the biggest, least compressed, most beautiful JPEG file. And if you want to shoot RAW at the same time, touch the RAW icon in the top area of the screen. If you don't want RAW, you can touch that dash beside the word RAW, and the same is true for JPEGs. You can touch the dash beside JPEG. The only thing you can't do is select both dashes for JPEG and RAW at the same time, because that means you're not shooting anything. Could you pick a smaller RAW file or a smaller JPEG option? Yeah, the 5D4 has that, but nobody buys a 30.4 megapixel high-end camera like this to shoot little pictures, so don't do it. Now, let's have a look at the quick control screen. Whether or not menus are still on your screen, just press the Info button. That's going to be right beside the menu button. Press it a few times and you'll toggle through a few different screens. The screen with some blue text and white text is the camera settings screen. It basically tells you what settings you have in your camera. There's also an electronic level, and after that is the quick control screen. You'll see your current shooting mode listed at the top left in a little box, and a bunch of additional information. But in A+ mode, you should still be there, a lot of the stuff is going to be grayed out because those things are automatically controlled in A+ or automatic mode. To adjust anything on the quick control screen, touch the Q and then touch the rectangle near the bottom center of the screen. So when you touch that box, you see your options. You've got a single shot, you've got 7 frames a second continuous shooting. That's the stack icon with the H by it for high speed. The plain stack icon is low speed continuous. The icons with the letter S beside them are going to be silent shooting, and while they aren't really technically silent, they are the quietest sounding shutter I've ever heard from a Canon DSLR, and it's a big improvement over previous models. The last two icons are for a 10-second and 2-second timer, respectively. So you can use the drive mode that you want and touch the curved arrow at the bottom right, and that's going to take you back to the previous screen. And at this point, your camera really is ready to go. But let's quickly look at playback before you go shooting so you can see what you shot. Take some pictures of whatever is around you right now, in your home, in your office, stuff on your desk that's in the room with you. Just don't shoot 6 or 8 identical pictures of the exact same thing. Move it around and shoot a few different things so that in playback mode it makes a little more sense. Now, press the playback button. It's the button with a triangle just above the trash button at the lower left. The image on screen is going to be the last image that you shot. And just like image review on your smartphone, you can swipe with your finger left and right to view previous or the next image. You can pinch zoom to zoom in or zoom out and check out the detail, and you can see a bunch of images all at once if you pinch zoom out enough. And when you zoom way in, you can drag around on screen to inspect your image detail. Finally, if you have a single image on screen and you press the info button, you can actually see some details or metadata about your image, like the shutter speed and the aperture that was used when you captured it. Then if you press info again, you can see even more image details and a histogram. And there's more info if you swipe scroll in the bottom area of the screen. A lot of people miss that. So if you're really excited to go shooting and you want to watch the other lessons in this class later on, I don't blame you. Go for it. The only thing that I'd suggest is something that I do for all my gear. Find the PDF of your manual online and download it to your smartphone so that you have your manual with you wherever you go. It's time to go do your first photo shoot, and we'll be talking about shooting modes in the next lesson when you get back. Beyond the fully automatic shooting mode are the professional shooting modes that you would expect. The first one is represented by the letter P, and that's the program mode. Now this is a mostly automatic exposure mode, but it does give you control over things like ISO, which is the brightness sensitivity of your sensor. You can pick your focus point, or you could let your camera pick it like it did with the A+ mode. You can shift the aperture and shutter speed in P mode, but the camera is going to do something where it keeps them in correct relationship to one another so you continue to get a good exposure. And you can do something called exposure compensation, where you do a little manual override and you tell your camera, I know you know how bright the exposure should be, but go ahead and make it a little brighter or make it a little darker. Put your camera mode dial into the P position and then press the info button however many times it takes to get you back to that quick control screen with the P at the top left. Now, this might be a little confusing because first there's the quick control screen that we're going to be using, and next is something called the custom quick control screen, and they both have a P at the top left, and they could look similar depending on how your camera is configured. As you would guess, you can go into menus and put just the stuff that you want on that custom quick control screen. But right now we're not going to do that. So just press info enough times to get to the first quick control screen. It looks like this. And then at the top right is the ISO. So if you want to adjust ISO, just touch Q at the lower left and then touch ISO. And then you can drag along the slider to pick your preferred ISO sensitivity. When you have what you want, you can touch the U-shaped arrow at the bottom right to return to the previous screen. If you don't want to pick your ISO number manually, you want to use Auto ISO, and it is on the far left of the number line, so just slide all the way that way and you'll see Auto ISO. If you half press the shutter button, the camera is going to grab focus, and based on the amount of light coming into the frame, it's going to pick what it thinks the proper shutter speed and aperture should be. And it'll show you those number values just to the right of the letter P on the quick control screen. Now, if you turn the main dial, that's this dial up here by the shutter button, you can stop down the aperture while adjusting the shutter speed, or vice versa. In program mode, these are hooked up together so that changing one is going to change the other. So when you turn that main dial, you'll see them both change at the same time. On the quick control screen, the numbered line that's just below the letter P and the shutter speed and the aperture number is for exposure compensation. You just touch the letter Q and then touch that dotted numbered line, and you can drag on screen to make the camera capture images that are going to be a little brighter or a little darker than it thinks that they should be. That's that manual override I talked about earlier. The next mode dial setting after the letter P is one labeled TV, and that's shutter priority. So once you're in shutter priority, you could change it with the touch screen. But this is one of those times that just turning the main dial with your index finger up here is going to be a little faster than going through a touch screen setting. You can go as slow as 30 seconds, or you can fire the shutter as fast as 1/8,000th of a second on this camera. Then, based on the shutter speed that you pick, the camera tries to do a balancing act with everything else to give you a good exposure. Faster shutter speeds can freeze action like sports or wildlife in motion. And longer shutter speeds can let in more light over time, so you might get motion blur if that's what you're going for. And a really long shutter speed can be used for things like night photography when your subject isn't moving. AV is aperture priority, that's the next setting, and you can change the size of the lens opening in order to control the depth of field. Of course, you're going to be limited by the lens you're using, but wide apertures like f2.8 or f1.4 can be used to create very shallow depth of field in portraits. If you use something like f8 or f11, you can pretty much try to get everything in the foreground and the background in focus, and f22 or f32 is something you might use where there's a very small opening so that a bright light source might get that artistic lens flare. And landscape shooters sometimes use a really small aperture like that with a long exposure to get really sharp detail throughout the image. And you definitely want to use a tripod for something like that. The next mode is M. M is the manual exposure mode, and you control the aperture with the main dial up here by the shutter button, and you control the shutter speed with the quick control dial. That's on the back of the camera to the right of the LCD. At this point, if you still have ISO set to auto, the camera will do its best to adjust the ISO based on whatever aperture and shutter speed settings that you have to give you a good exposure. But if you have manually adjusted the ISO to a specific number, and you manually set the aperture, and you manually set the shutter speed, then that numbered line there is no longer going to be exposure compensation. Instead, there's a little mark below the line that's the camera basically telling you what it thinks about the exposure. Think of it as a meter at that point. If it's under the 0, it thinks that you're right on for your exposure. But if that little tick mark is to the left of the 0, it thinks that your exposure is going to be a little too dark. You might want to make some exposure adjustments to compensate for that. Or if it's to the right of the 0, it's going to be a little bit too bright, overexposed. You can adjust either the aperture or the shutter speed or the ISO to get you a better exposure and try and get that tick mark right near the middle, near the 0. Next up is the B, and the B is going to be bulb mode. That's where the shutter stays open for as long as you hold down the shutter button. Now that's not really practical for most people when they use the bulb mode, so they use it in combination with a wired remote shutter button, and we shoot things like fireworks with that setting. The next 3 shooting modes are C1, C2, and C3, and these are all custom shooting modes. So let's say there's a regular studio setup that you have with preset lighting, and you use it all the time. You can get your camera all dialed in, get the results that you like, and then save those settings. So here's how you set it. Leave your camera in the mode wherever you have your good settings, like in manual mode, and then press the menu button and go to the 5th wrench menu. The second item down is where you register your current settings. And when you touch register settings, then you're allowed to pick C1, C2, or C3. And all those settings that you have in your camera right now will go into that shooting mode. And so from now on, if you go back there, you're already preset. Of course, You can update those settings later if you want to using this same menu, or you can enable auto update in that same wrench menu. And then later, when you're using your C1 or C2 or C3 settings and you make an adjustment, that adjustment will stick. There's a shooting mode that you can turn on in menus called mirror lockup. The logic here is that there's a little bit of vibration caused by the mirror flipping up every single time you press the shutter button inside the camera, and even though there's just a slight vibration, it can slightly blur your images, even if it's mounted on a tripod. With mirror lockup on, you have to press the shutter button twice. The first press is going to move the mirror out of the way. The second press fires the shutter and then drops the mirror back down into position. And in the old days, like last year, when live view autofocus was pretty slow and far less accurate than autofocus using the optical viewfinder. But since live view shooting uses an all-new, super fast, very accurate focusing system, there's almost no reason to shoot with the mirror lockup feature. So let's talk about live view shooting now. The start-stop button that's just to the right of the optical viewfinder is what you press to turn on live view shooting for stills. This flips the mirror up, like we were just discussing, but you also get the preview of what's going on your rear LCD screen. If you half press the shutter, it will pick what it thinks is the proper focus point and then flash some green boxes on the LCD to tell you what is going to be the primary focus point. But that is a touch screen, remember. And by default, wherever you just touch on the rear LCD, it's going to lock focus there. And then you see the little icon at the lower left on the screen. When you touch that, it turns on a function called touch shutter. So now, wherever you touch on screen, it's going to focus there and it's going to take a picture without you having to separately press the shutter button. Two more quick things about live view shooting, and then we'll move on to autofocus. First, when you have the live view showing on the LCD, that super handy quick control screen is gone, but you still have quick access to some of the important settings that might be in there. Just touch the Q and now it's going to be at the top right of your live view screen, and you'll have quick on-screen touch control access to a bunch of important settings. And when you're done, touch that U-shaped arrow at the top right to go back to the regular live view screen for your shooting. The last thing to note here is that there's a toggle around the start-stop button. When you move that toggle to the red movie camera icon, you're in movie capture mode. And pressing the start-stop button doesn't just give you a view on the back, it actually starts and stops movie recording. We'll talk about movies in another lesson, but it's time for autofocus. You already know that switching the toggle around the live view start-stop button is how you get to movie shooting mode, and you know that pressing that button starts and stops video recording when it's set to the little movie camera. Let's look at settings that you can make before filming and stuff that you can do during video capture. When the toggle is in movie mode and your shooting mode dial is not in A+, you have access to a bunch of video capture menu settings. You also have on-screen access with the Q button, like we did with live view shooting before your filming starts. To make things easy, let's use menus here. Press the menu button and go to the number 4 camera menu. If your toggle is in movie mode right now, it'll say Movie Servo AF at the top of the list. You know what the first 3 menu items do, so touch Movie Record Quality in the middle. You can pick MOV or MP4 file formats, and the next one down lets you pick your movie size and your frame rate. Inside that screen, you can pick 1080p at different frame rates and different compressions, and you can even pick 4K video. By the way, all 4K video is going to be saved as motion JPEG, and you can't change that in camera. If you want to download your 4K footage and then edit it even faster in some other format, you'll need to convert it once you move it over to your computer. One other note is that you'll have problems with 4K video unless you have a super fast SD card or a UDMA7 compact flash card. Canon is going to recommend the UDMA7 CF card. They did a lot of testing with that, so I would go that way. Even my fastest SD cards just can't keep up with the 4K recording. During video capture, you have all kinds of new capabilities because of that awesome touchscreen. You can make smooth adjustments. So put your camera's shooting mode dial in the manual position so that you can control aperture and shutter speed manually. Now, during filming, you can intuitively adjust them by just touching on the screen. Now, this next thing doesn't work for 4K video, but it does work for the 1080p video. If you want your camera to knock down highlights that maybe are blown out in high contrast videos where you have bright areas in the frame, you can capture HDR movies. Just realize that this isn't going to work with 4K videos because of the technology that they use, and you're going to have to put your movie capture mode in 1080p 30 or 1080p 25. Then, in movie live view, before you start filming, touch the Q and touch the lower right box and choose Enable. The 5D Mark IV can capture time-lapse movies in camera. It captures them as 1080p movies at 30 frames a second or 25 frames a second, depending on what video system setting your camera is set for. In North America, we use the NTSC standard, and PAL is used elsewhere in the world, but I'm not teaching that stuff. Also, your time-lapse movies will be saved as MOV files, not MP4. With the Live View toggle in the video position, press the Menu button and go under the number 5 Camera menu. Touch Time-Lapse Movie in the middle of that screen, touch Enable. And then before you touch the word Set or OK at the bottom right, touch Info at the bottom left of the screen so that you can enter all your settings about the time-lapse video. Then you're good to go. Finally, if your movie servo is set to Enable and your AF method is set to Flexi Zone Single, you can touch Focus to change the focus point during filming. You could be filming something in the distance and then decide that you want to touch something that's in the foreground, and when you do that, it will actually refocus there. It's not going to change the zoom aspect of your lens, but it changes the focus point. If you have one of the newer modern Canon USM or STM lenses, you can do this, and you can even change the focus slowly or in a snap. Look at page 383 of your manual for details on changing the speed of that refocusing during filming. All right, let's talk about white balance and metering. A couple more aspects of capturing a proper exposure have to do with the color of light in your environment and measuring how much light there is so that your settings capture the right amount for your image. I'm sure you know that different light sources might have a tint of color to them. For example, old-fashioned light bulbs like a tungsten bulb give off a little bit of a warm cast. Midday sunshine is pretty much considered white, and that very same sun at sunset can give you a warm orange cast to everything because the light is filtering through the atmosphere. So the default setting is AWB, that stands for automatic white balance, and it does a good job of guessing what the tint of light sources is and compensating for it. Then again, if you're sure of your light source and you don't want the camera to do the guessing for you, you can set it and you can lock it. Like in a studio where you're using on-camera flash or off-camera flash, or in fluorescent lights. You can run through these options at your convenience, but let me show you where you can pick your settings. On the quick control screen, touch the letter Q so that it's touch sensitive, and then touch the second box from the left under the exposure compensation dotted line. By default, it's going to say AWB there. Mine does. In the screen that comes up, you can pick sunshine, or shade, or clouds, or fluorescent, and so on. On the far right, you can dial in a specific setting if you know the degrees Kelvin you want to use, and the second to last is called custom white balance. This is where you can take a shot of something in the light that you're working in, and you shoot something that's white. Then you press the menu button and go to the second camera menu, and you pick custom white balance near the middle of the menu. The camera is going to bring up the most recent picture that you shot. Now just touch Set at the lower left of the screen in order to tell the camera that you want to use that image as a reference for what settings should indicate appropriate white in your lighting environment. One last thing about white balance is that there are now 2 AWB settings. This is new to a lot of people. The first one is the plain old AWB, and when you're in someplace with a little bit of warmth to the light, maybe like in a tungsten lighting environment, the camera will try to keep some of that warmth. But if you want true, pure white, even in those warmer environments, you want to touch the Q on the quick control screen, then touch to go to your white balance settings, then touch AWB, and that's at the beginning of the list, and then you touch where it says info at the bottom of your screen, and that's where you get 2 choices. And the one that says AWBW is the one that gets rid of that little warm tint in tungsten lighting, and it makes everything really white. By the way, whatever white balance setting you have, if you're shooting raw and you want to change your white balance after the shoot, you can absolutely do that when you process your raw files. At the time of this recording, Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom haven't updated their software to handle 5D Mark IV files yet, so you can only do it in Canon's Digital Photo Professional software. Then again, Adobe can do an update any minute. So besides looking at the color of light in your environment, the camera also measures the amount of light so that it can help you capture a properly lit exposure. That's exposure metering, and it can measure light in the frame 4 ways. Touch the Q on the quick control screen, and then touch the box just to the right of your autofocus operation on the bottom row. That's where you'll see the 4 metering choices. Here's what they do. Evaluative metering looks at all the light in your image frame, and it does the best that it can to give you a nicely balanced image. I use this almost all the time, and I've gotten great results. Partial metering covers a little more than 6% at the center of the viewfinder area, and it gives priority to light levels there. Spot metering is even more precise, and it looks at light in the center, and it only covers about 1.3% of the image area in the middle. And then center weighted average is going to look at the whole screen, but it's going to give priority to the middle area in the screen. Just so you know, Canon updated evaluative metering, and while it's looking at all the light in your scene, if it happens to see a face in your image area, it's going to give priority to the face. So your exposure looks really good for capturing faces, even if it means a little less balanced exposure in other parts of your image.